I'm Carol Chris, the director of the Center for Studies in Higher Education. I'm delighted to welcome you here to this symposium. I'm so glad that so many of you braved the rain to come. On the most fundamental level, public universities were established to educate undergraduates. We all know the language of the Morrill Act. The purpose of the land-grant colleges for which the Act provided federal land was, and this is the quote, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts in such manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions of life. Public universities inevitably became more complex than the language of this legislation suggests, evolving into the multiversity that Clark Kerr first defined in his Godkin lectures at Harvard in 1963. Even at that point, more than 50 years ago, Kerr worried about the effect of this growing complexity on undergraduate education. He writes, "There seems to be a point of no return, after which research, consulting, graduate instruction becomes so absorbing that faculty efforts can no longer be concentrated on undergraduate education as they once were." He continues, as a quote, "How to escape the cruel paradox that a superior faculty results in an inferior concern for undergraduate teaching is one of our more pressing concerns." In the final pages of his lecture, he returns to this subject, and in 1963, he identifies the improvement of undergraduate education as one of the most consequential problems facing the university. Once again, I quote, "It will require the solution of many sub-problems: how to give adequate recognition to the teaching skill as well as to the research performance of faculty, how to create a curriculum that serves the needs of the students as well as the research interests of the teacher." And this is a particularly interesting one, I think, how to prepare the generalist as well as the specialist in an age of specialization looking for better generalizations. How to make the university seem smaller, even as it grows larger. How to establish a range of contact between faculty and students broader than the one-way route across the lectern, or, and here he's dated, through the television screen. How to raise educational policy again to the forefront of faculty concerns. I like so much that Clark Kerr wrote, this is amazingly prescient. We might add to his concerns the pressures that scale and shrinking budgets place on the quality of undergraduate education. In our conference today and tomorrow, we'll address the advantages and the challenges of undergraduate education in the public research university, exploring many of the subjects that Kerr raises. We will begin by asking the question, how precisely can we define the public research university advantage? John Douglas, Igor Chirikov, and Gregg Thomson will present findings from SERU, Student Experience in the Research University, the major survey project that's been collecting data since 2002 about the quality of student experience in the research university. A robust consortium of almost 40 partner universities, both domestic and foreign, SERU has created a rich trove of data to answer many questions critical to our understanding of the nature and quality of undergraduate experience in the research university. This evening, we're going to hear Mark Schlissel, president of the University of Michigan, give the first of our two keynotes. Tomorrow morning, we'll hear about the critical relationship of cost and enrollment capacity. That's the first panel. And the second is about scaling high-impact practices. Our second keynote is an interview with Chancellor Nicholas Dirks and Provost Claude Steele, which I'm going to play Terry Gross. And it'll take place right after lunch, and we'll end the day with a session on implementing change. I mean, so many of us know what best practices are, but how do you get to the point where you can actually affect them in the universities of which you're a member? It should be a rich and productive day and a half of presentation and discussion. I now introduce the leader of our first panel, John Douglas. John is a senior research fellow at the Center for Studies in Higher Education. He's the co-founder of the SERU Consortium and its architect. He's the author of 3 books, The California Idea and American Higher Education, The Conditions for Admissions, and just this year, it's just published, The New Flagship University, Changing the Paradigm from Global Ranking to National Relevancy. He's one of the most important writers and thinkers on higher education today, and we're very fortunate to have him at Berkeley and at the center. John.
Thank you very much, Carol. And I thought you did a great job of introducing the forthcoming events and also bringing back a voice that just continues to reverberate, not just here at Berkeley, but everywhere in the world, and that's Clark Kerr. And as you'll see in this presentation, we again are using some of the metaphors and ideas that Kerr presented in his critique of the university, most prominently in 1963 in his Godkin lectures, but in years that went on after that. But before we launch into data and analysis, which we are going to provide some, sorry about that, I want to at least describe to you briefly a bit about the SERU Consortium. There are other surveys and activities going on, but there are some unique aspects to our effort with SERU. And first is that we really focus on a research university environment. We are looking, and we often use this kind of way of talking about it, we're looking at not only the teaching and learning experience of students, but also their role in the university in the research production and the production of knowledge, and also public and community service, and see this as kind of a more holistic way of saying, well, what is the student's experience within this famous tripartite mission of universities, and how do they contribute to the academic community that is focused on these important aspects of the university's purpose. As Carol noted, this goes back to, actually it starts with the year 2000, where we had a series of meetings here at Berkeley that included both academics and institutional researchers to talk about, well, what is it that we could do that's a coherent effort to look at the student experience within the then 8 undergraduate campuses of the University of California. We now have a 9th with UC Merced. And we looked at other surveys that existed. Obviously, NESE is one, many of you know that survey. But the sense was, A, that it was not focused enough on questions that relate to this tripartite mission and the role of students in that. And also, at that time, it was sample surveys, and we knew we needed lots of data to be able to understand what is happening in the university environment, or research-intensive university environment, where the discipline is really important, and there are many subpopulations with different kinds of experiences. So you need a good, large data set to really understand that. So we moved towards our own version of a survey, a very collaborative effort within the UC system, and developed a census online survey that also had aspects of customization. So what this all means is it isn't just a general survey that's done everywhere. There's lots of work involved in collaborating and doing this work. And I will say now, although in the earlier stages we did the survey work here out of Berkeley, we now have survey administration and management and other things in collaboration with the University of Minnesota for the American side, and our universities are all, with a few exceptions, AAU members. That's our concept. We're not trying to be all things to all people, but focus on that. And on the international side, our partner is the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. So here's a listing of the current AAU members. Again, there are a few UC campuses, which was part of our original development of the project, that are not AAU members. Maybe they will be someday soon. It is amazing how many campuses of the University of California are world top-ranked institutions and are AAU members. And this shows the list pretty much in chronological order of how when they joined. We also have, on the international side, a number of institutions. Not all are currently using the survey administration, but they're in our circle, in our sphere of influence, and you can see it's quite an impressive list. I think we are noting that we've just added Lancaster University, and it looks like Utrecht and Lund are also joining, and we would like to have a good solid group of top-tier universities in Europe and elsewhere, but it would be good to have that in the mix. So the other thing is, again, it is customized. We had just had a session in an earlier portion of this program that was for the SERU representatives and invited guests. And the cultural differences are significant, and this is an ongoing part of the discussion. What is it like to be in a university environment, and what are the expectations and actual experience of students in China versus South Africa versus Brazil? And those are many, this is a constant discussion. And what I would say is, from my overall experience in this project, is that at one time, we thought many of the international universities would have a lot of customization to the survey instrument, but really what happens is we found that that we have a lot of similar goals, and so the questions that we have, this core that is shared, which is a pretty high percentage, notes, at least it provides an explanation that we see a similar goal, we're interested in similar things, we're just kind of on different trajectories or different positions within that. So customization, though, is very important in this project, and these are just some of the posters that you see. The first is from Hunan, which has used the language that we use here in the UC system of let's see, what is that? I can barely read it. Every student has a voice, and every student has a voice, every voice will be heard. Thank you, Gregg. I've already forgotten that. And so, and then the other is from Osaka University, and this is the Russian version, which is very hard to read. And then just to give you a sense, again, we have built a survey structure. Again, it's been an extremely collaborative project, which is, again, great because I think we've come out with a very high quality instrument, but it's a lot of work too. A lot of work by a lot of different people over time. But this is the general structure. We have a core set of questions, and then we have a series of modules that are topical, and that allows institutions to customize more what they really want to focus on. And these are the current grouping of modules, but we're always in discussions about additional modules that can be done as samples or sent as survey. And then, as I noted before, every campus has a wild card. We have, after we've been working on this now for some 4 or 5 years, and we're now at a point where we now have a graduate student survey. This is another need. All of our members of the SERU membership have substantial graduate programs. They're often world ranked, and so this is a natural extension, we think, of what we're doing. And we're following a similar kind of module design. And there has been piloting of the survey. Utrecht University, for example, and their interest in joining is heavily focused on having comparative benchmark data related to graduate student experience. So this just gives you, again, a sense of the general structure. Now, the other thing I'm very happy to say, and I think our colleagues in the project, such as Gregg, Thomson, and Igor Chirikov, who are joining me today, we're also very happy to say that the data is actually used. I think there's a lot of survey data that is not always used in any very coherent or long-term way. But we have a track record, and it does vary by institutional type. And I would say on the international side, most universities don't have a lot of experience in development of having an IR office, institutional research capacity, but that's changing very rapidly, and that's partly why they're interested in a survey instrument like SERU. But as you can see, this kind of overall look of the different usages of the data. I will say, I think on the American side, most of our AAU institutions see this as a very vital component of program review, and if there are a couple of pillars towards internal academic quality, and that program review is definitely one of them. Accreditation is also used often in accreditation. But getting back down to the other areas, the research and policy area, what we're about to present here really relates to this larger research agenda. I like to say, although I don't think everyone agrees with me in the project, that this is a academic research project that has administrative uses. But there are some who believe this is an administrative project that has academic uses. That's a constant tension, and but I think the important part is that we do have a research agenda. It's not just about collecting data and having it used in important ways by campuses in their internal analysis, that we link the research, and the research helps us inform us also about what kind of questions we want to ask students. So it's an iterative process, and I think we do have a pretty good track record of research output that is meaningful and has an influence on the field, and by policies at universities as well. And so now I'm going to just kind of talk about this project, what we're calling the Research University Advantage Project. We've used that name. We have to be a little careful. It's kind of our umbrella name. As you can see, we're really talking in this particular presentation about looking at research, the actual engagement of students themselves within a certain grouping of the data set. We do think eventually we can do some comparative data, like how does it, what's the difference between, say, the experience at Berkeley versus a small liberal arts college, or something like that. But we don't have that other data set quite yet. And to be frank with you, there's not the range of questions in any other survey that exists out there. So that's a challenge for us. But that's not our principal point and objective in this particular presentation of our research effort. So this is partly a reaction, or at least being informed by what we would say is a national discussion of some sort in the United States. Some of our foreign international friends aren't quite aware of this, but there was a very important book that came out called Academically Adrift that added to an existing concerns about the university and its and how it values and supports undergraduate education. Some of the criticism which Carol noted obviously goes back very far. And so, basically in this book, which was based on, I won't get into this, but on a standardized test, the Collegiate Learning Assessment instrument, had a very small portion of actual number of students who were in it. It had many different kinds of institutional types. So there's some methodological things, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Just to note that, basically the conclusion was, a broad conclusion was that, that I can barely read this, the curriculum is not rigorous, that students do not spend enough time in class and studying, and that students do not learn enough. And most are drifting through their academic careers. And again, this was a conclusion. The book is much more nuanced than this, but the gist of the national discussion that has been picked up by newspapers, and this is one example, it's official. College students learn next to nothing. I think if you're involved with students, but just human development generally, very few people learn nothing in 4 years. But I don't know. Maybe I'm an optimist. What can I say? But so is this true? And this isn't the only thing we're really looking at in this study, but it is something we want to react to and think about. As I said, this is a perception that's not totally new, not the learning, people not learning anything, but that the students aren't engaged or being supported by these large research institutions. And it's a real concern. I'm not downplaying it. It's important. And the Boyer report, if you recall, in the 1990s noted this, and also noted things that universities should do, including increasing the research engagement of students. And I will say that I think we don't have a then and now data, but our experience looking at our AU institutions is that they've done significant things to increase the amount of various kinds of research engagement that students have, and we think it has some very important results as well. And there's another part of this discussion that sits there, and that is this kind of growing sense that really going to a university or going to college in some form is really about generating strictly labor skills and having that will determine their future personal income. This kind of very utilitarian structural look at what is happening at the student experience. So we want to kind of look at that, and we have a data set that is not just the survey data, but we can link it to other data sets, and this is part of the power also of the SERU Consortium concept. We're not just having the survey data, but we can link it to GPA and SAT scores and other things like that. So here's our kind of broader view that undergraduates at research-intensive universities have opportunities for multiple forms of engagement and learning that are perhaps unique in their range and in their depth. So we're going to touch on that. I'm not saying that we have the comparative data to confirm that statement, but we think there's something there. And that the purpose of higher education should be to produce graduates equipped for both careers and to be democratic citizens, and these kind of broader concepts of being active people within their communities. And you know the data linking higher education with more volunteer work, voting, healthier people, these kinds of things. We're not going to go into that, but it is an important conceptual idea. And I think we also want to note that this focus that's been promulgated by academically Adrift, and kind of this link towards this idea that really the only experience that is worth noting is the pure kind of forms of academic engagement. Being in the class and studying are the things that are really we need to look at. Are students learning anything? Are they learning things in the discipline or the major? And these other kinds of skills seem to be kind of lost, or attributes that they gain by going to a university or to a liberal arts college. And so this is just an example of a template for a recent graduate's resume that Yale suggests for students that gives you this concept that when they're going out into the employment market, it's not just about their GPA or kind of narrow bands of what we kind of think of like SAT scores and things like that. They want to know this broad range of a student's experience. So this is just one example in an earlier presentation that we had in SERU that in the SERU meeting that Tongshan had. He also had Tongshan Chang, our colleague at the University of California Office of the President, had a very interesting chart that also had results from what employers think are of value, and it reflects this kind of order, a much more diverse order of skills. So we're using this, in this particular data analysis, we're using this metaphor of the multiversity, and you're saying multi-engagement, that these universities are, that the modern comprehensive university is like a city. This is again using Kerr's kind of conceptual lens. It has many subcultures, experiences, and responsibilities that reflect its growing role in society. That's not a quote, but it's a summation. But here's a quote. Some get lost in the city, Clark Kerr once explained, while others, both faculty and students, find communities within the larger institution. The city, continued Kerr, is more like the totality of civilization. And so within that kind of structure and thinking, one question is, are our AAU institutions, our top-tier research universities that we're looking at in this data set, helping students to navigate the city, to take advantage of the multiple opportunities that we know are there, and leading to different kinds of engagement and learning? And are they innovating in an era of, as Carol noted, of diminished public resources? Many of these institutions, most, all of our public AAUs are facing significant financial difficulties, which often result in rising student-to-faculty ratios. So are they innovating and doing things related to that? We're not answering that question so much, but I think it's a good one. And we see some results that we indicate that perhaps these large universities are innovating and doing interesting things. So now to just kind of say briefly a little bit about our conceptual lens before I hand it over to Gregg to note some of the data and summaries, and then Igor to dig even deeper into the data set. we use this conceptual lens. We could do other things. We have other data in the SERU data set, but our focus here is on 4 spheres of the student experience. One is, of course, curricular engagement. The other is research engagement, public and community service, and then extracurricular activities. And we're trying to paint what we think is a holistic understanding of the student experience, with the caveat that there is no one student experience. There are many student experiences, and that's why you need a large data set in order to be able to explore that. And that's why if you take a standardized test and you take 150 students from Berkeley, and then they take that test over a couple of years, and then you're going to make a judgment about learning, it just doesn't work, because there's just such a vast array of different kinds of learning styles, but also academic programs with different demands and skills. And so thinking in that way, well, if I was to generate an average, maybe this is the actual average, or at least the popular sense of the average, which is every student should be in class, and that's their experience. And now again, we're talking about top-tier research universities. We're being selective here, so this is not talking about community colleges or, say, comprehensive or teacher-intensive universities and colleges. So this is just a way of talking about this grouping of institutions. So the popular sense, this is one way of looking at it, but maybe the reality is something closer to this. Looking, at least this is slightly reflective of the data. It's just a way of painting a picture. And then if you were really to talk about it, it's really a lot more like this. The interaction between these different activities are really a key component of really understanding the student experience or experiences and being able to evaluate it. And then, what I would say is that, again, just to reiterate, disciplines matter. So maybe this is closer to what the average is for a third-year engineering major. Totally made up, but just illustrative, okay? So, the research questions that we pose, these are our major research questions that then Gregg will entice you with some of our results. Do students appear to be engaged or adrift when various modes of engagement, curricular, research, extracurricular, and civic are examined? To what extent are various modes of engagement mutually exclusive, independent or correlated? How do the patterns of engagement vary by student background, GPA, level of study, and level and field of study? How various forms of engagement affect student learning outcomes, satisfaction, career plans, and job outcomes. And one thing I should note about our data set, but also about the questionnaire, we do have some slides if someone asks about what's the range of questions we have. That's, would take a lot of time, but what I would say is what we have are kind of low order to high order questions. The low order questions are, do you go to class? Do you do your homework? How much do you sleep? How much do you party? These kinds of things. And the high order is, are you satisfied? Do you think it's value for money to come to this campus? Would you come here again? Do you feel like you belong? Do you feel alienated? So these are these kind of a range of questions. And again, the structure and the size of our institutions allows us to generate significant number of responses. I'm not sure where we are at the moment. Ron might know, who's here, Ron Huseman from our colleague at Minnesota. But we may be getting close to, what do you think, 700,000, 800 of just US responses in the full data set over time. But this data set we're looking at is 2014. But the one thing I have to note to you, at least at this stage in our analysis, is that we're only looking at these institutions, the non-UCs, because in that year, in 2014, a UC chose to have a more limited set of questions to its survey, and so we're looking at how to combine it, but it doesn't have the range of questions that we can use in this larger data set that we chose for 2014. So out of this, we have 11 AU institutions, the ones that are highlighted, and we have over 63,000 student responses. And so I'm going to leave that now for Gregg to talk about the structural, how we chose to do the analysis.
Thanks, Joe. Well, I'll go through this quite quickly. Igor actually did all the heavy lifting on this research and decided on the methodology to actually do a very sophisticated factor analysis to develop indices across the 4 dimensions that John has identified that we're interested in looking at. I'll just skip the details here, just to tell you that it was a very well thought out methodology to look at the principles of scales and make sure that we interpret them correctly. And one of the main questions that John posed, fundamental question, if we're looking at these 4 dimensions of engagement, is the extent to which these 4 spheres of engagement are, as John said, mutually exclusive, independent, or correlated. And the basic takeaway from this table is that these 4 dimensions are weakly correlated. I mean, they're statistically significantly correlated given the 63,000 cases. But basically, curricular engagement correlates with the other 3 forms of engagement at about a level of 0.2 to 0.3, even after controlling for various background variables. Research engagement actually has the lowest correlation with the other 3 factors, tends to be under 0.2. Civic engagement ranges from under 0.2 to the highest correlation being about 0.3 between civic engagement and co-curricular engagement. So the takeaway here is that there's a modest correlation among these spheres, but it's not the case that only a subset of students are highly engaged across all the different dimensions, and therefore everyone else is not engaged. Okay. In fact, Igor did a calculation that if you just look at students that are in the lowest quartile, and all these findings for this particular approach are in terms of relative terms within the distribution that we're looking at. If you look at just students that are in the lowest quartile across all 4 of these dimensions, sort of relatively way at the bottom, that's less than 1% of the students. Or if you look at students that are below the median in all 4 areas, that's 8% of the students. Conversely, if you look at the students that are above the median, and again, this is relative and this is a relatively weak measure, but nonetheless an instructive one. If you look at the students that are above the median in the distribution on these 4 indices that have been created, fully 92% are above the median at least 1 or more times. Or the statistic I think that probably makes even more sense in terms of intuitive feeling for engagement. If you look at the students that are just in the upper quartile in these 4 dimensions, 67%, 2/3 of the students of our undergraduates are in the upper quartile in at least one of the 4 dimensions of engagement. So then the question is, in a little more detail, what is the overlap? And I'll go through these relatively quickly just to give you a hint of the pictures. This gives you an example of above average, the overlap between curricular engagement and research engagement. I mean, there is an overlap, 41%, but the majority are in only one and not both of these 2 different dimensions. Or if you look at 3 of the dimensions taken simultaneously, you see that 24% above average are in all 3, and you can see, again, the independent patterns. So it's another statistic then to talk about in terms of the multiple forms of engagement. If you're using the measure of just above the median in the 4 dimensions, fully 73% of the undergraduates in this data set are above the median in at least one of the dimensions. Or perhaps more telling, in using the upper quartile as our criterion, 37% are engaged in multiple dimensions across the four different spheres. And I think this has a pretty good intuitive sense. We can say, at this point, more than a third of our students appear to be engaged in the upper quartile in more than one dimension. So now digging deeper into the results, Igor.
Thank you very much. And after looking at how whether students are engaged or adrift, we decided to look at each area of engagement and see what factors influence a particular area. So if you look at the curricular engagement in the classroom, then we see that students that are more engaged and engaged in an upper quartile that demonstrate high curricular engagement, they tend to spend more time studying, they tend to complete more assigned course reading, and they also tend to have a higher GPA as compared to the low curricular engagement. And by saying high, I mean students who are in the upper quartile of this index, and low curricular engagement students that are in the lower quartile of this index. And if you look at the different socioeconomic factors and characteristics of students, we see that curricular engagement, there are significant variation across social classes. For example, wealthy students and upper middle class students tend to have higher percentage of engaged students as opposed to working class or middle class students. Race also matters, parental education matters, and those students who have parents with a postgraduate degree, they tend to have higher curricular engagement. Also, there is a variation by the field of study. We see more engagement in arts and humanities, business and professional majors as compared to STEM. We see that there's no difference depending on SAT and ACT scores of students. We see that seniors tend to have higher curricular engagement and transfer students as well. If we look at the research engagement, we see that those students who have higher rates of research engagement, they more likely to expect to pursue a scientific career in research and science. There are more of them who plan to earn a doctorate degree as well, which is natural for this kind of engagement. And also, if we look at the learning outcomes, and SERU contains a number of self-reported learning outcomes with these advantages and disadvantages. We see that students with high and low research engagement, they report similar levels of initial levels of current library and other research skills. And but when they surveyed those students who have higher research engagement, they report much higher research and library research skills. Also, those students who have higher research engagement, they have slightly higher GPA. Also, we see a variation by student characteristics, but compared to curricular engagement, no difference by social class, no different by race, but there's different by parental education, by gender. Female students tend to be more engaged in research. We see that international students tend to be more engaged as well. There is a variation by field of study. Again, no variation by SAT and SAT scores. Seniors, again, tend to have higher research engagement, and there is no difference whether it's freshman or transfer student. If we now turn to civic engagement, similar to the research, we see that those students who have higher civic engagement, they tend to plan to pursue a career in psychology or helping professions, and they also there are more students who plan to pursue a career in education, and they also report higher levels of the ability to appreciate racial and ethnic diversity. And we cannot do a casual inference, but at the same time, we see that there is a correlation list between these two factors, and there is no difference in GPA by civic engagement. Again, if we look at the student characteristics, we see that low-income students tend to have higher level of civic engagement, while all other, no difference in all other categories. Again, female students are more engaged. Students in social sciences and professional fields are more engaged, and again, senior students tend to have higher engagement. And the last is extracurricular engagement. We see that students that are more engaged in extracurricular activities are more likely to pursue career in business. And they report higher levels of leadership skills, interpersonal skills, ability to make a presentation with similar levels of initial skills. And again, engaged students tend to have a higher GPA. Similar differences by student characteristics, upper, middle class, and wealthy students show significantly higher level of extracurricular engagement. Those students who have parents with postgraduate degree also have higher extracurricular engagement. So do business students and seniors. In addition to that, we explored the multi-engagement, whether or not students that are engaged in different areas have different characteristics from those who are not engaged, who are not multi-engaged. And we see that there are some differences as well. We see that there are more multi-engaged students among upper middle class and wealthy students. There are more of them among social sciences, business and professional majors, and juniors and seniors. Also, we related the engagement with the self-reported learning outcomes. And this table demonstrates top 5 areas that associated with each of this area. And we see that those lists are quite different, especially the top one. Those are self-reported learning gains for upper division students that have 2 or more steps increase. And the questions are structured like this. What's level, how do you characterize your level of ability when you started the university? And how do you characterize your level of ability now? And upper division students responded, and we observed, we analyzed all the areas that they have 2 or more steps increase. And those are areas of all of the areas that are in SERU survey that demonstrate the highest gains. And as you can see, curricular engagement is associated with the ability to prepare and make a presentation, research skills, analytical, critical thinking skills, of course, understanding in the field of study. Research engagement, not surprisingly, associated with research skills, civic engagement with ability to appreciate in cultural and global diversity, and extracurricular engagement with leadership skills. And also, before we go to conclusions, we just wanted to stress that we also have an opportunity for an international comparison, and because SERU is administered not only in the US but also in the other countries. And as John noted, in the academically Adrift, there is a claim that American students study not enough and not so many hours that they spend studying. And so our data actually shows that it's true, American students attend classes much less than Chinese students and Russian students, but at the same time, they study more outside of the classroom. And this indicates that if we consider the time spent studying, they spend more time outside of the classroom, which is some studies show that this is more efficient to study outside of the classroom. Of course, there are a number of limitations. We don't claim that this is a universal truth. The indices that we're working with are data sensitive, and if we will use another data set, we can observe different outcomes and different correlations. So at the same time, in addition, we have a lack of responses in civic and extracurricular engagement. Another limitation is that, and we discussed that before in a SERU symposium, that SERU survey questions measure particular types of engagement and don't measure others. Like, for example, they measure whether how often students participate in the discussion, but don't measure how often a student read books in the library. So probably we have to think more about how engagement can be captured in a better way. Another very significant limitation that we define engagement in the relative terms when we say about students that are more engaged or less engaged. It's a natural limitation of the project that we don't have a comparison group that we can, for example, compare research universities with other types of institutions and see what's the differences and how these correlations work in different type of environment. And so I'd like to give floor back to Gregg for some conclusions.
Thank you, Igor. These next slides just sort of summarize the background variables that are associated with this first one with lower levels of engagement. Oh, did I go by? Am I in higher? Oh, that one. Oh, I'm sorry. Then just to summarize the overall percentages of engagement as we noted already. Then 92% of the students with a modest definition of being highly engaged above the median fall in that category for one or more of the four categories. 67 using the upper quartile are engaged at least in one of the areas, and 37% are multi-engaged using the upper quartile definition. So our really main basic takeaway here is that the forms of engagement are not independent, but they're also not highly correlated at all. And each offers a unique array of experiences that it complements the others in terms of the multiple pathways to engagement through the university. Is one way of looking at it. And if we just summarize the background characteristics associated with what we're seeing in terms of the patterns of correlations with the various forms of engagement, what I really emphasize here is in particular the one that keeps coming up over and over again, in that obviously engagement is correlated with how far along you are in school. Hardly a surprise here, but that in terms of patterns of low engagement, it tends to be the freshmen and sophomores. If we want to look at really the flip side, patterns of higher engagement, in terms of curricular engagement, wealthy and upper middle class. And just be careful here in our student data, the percentage of students who self-identify as wealthy is really quite small, regardless of parental income. We're really talking about the upper middle class, they're a pattern of being more curricularly engaged. But as Igor pointed out, there are different ways of looking at engagement. And the one we're capturing with this scale is things like classroom interaction, collaborative learning, so forth and so on. And those tend to also be related with choice of discipline. In other words, there's going to be more class discussion in some kinds of classes as opposed to others. And that's actually related to class background in terms of your choice of major. Then again, seniors, more curricular development. Research, again, in terms of students who are oriented toward research, high levels of research in the multi-university tend to come from more highly educated family backgrounds, tend to be international students, and again, tend to be seniors. Civic engagement, I want to talk about a little bit. Interestingly, these students tend to be significantly more from lower income backgrounds, tend to be more women, and tend to be in the social sciences and professions, and of course seniors as they're working their way through. And when we talk about civic engagement, we're talking about a range of activities here and ways in which students can be civically engaged, or community service, civic engaged class community service. It can be everything from doing volunteering to be in a typical form is tutoring, or working as a volunteer in a hospital if you're a pre-med student, to way more active forms of civic engagement in terms of community organizing and really almost perhaps even confronting the status quo as opposed to just being part of it. So one of the themes here that's very clear is that one of the pathways of engagement that we're discovering in our data, and that is correlated with students who are coming in from lower income backgrounds, perhaps can be captured under the notion of giving back to the community, of the orientation being not just in a profession where, as John emphasized, that you're going to make a lot of money, but you're going to do something meaningful in the university. Gives you a pathway to develop those skills and experiences. Similarly, with the extracurricular, co-curricular, very strong findings here. Again, off the top, it looks like students who are coming in with more highly educated families, but also it does tend to be correlated with the field of study. Business students in particular are very oriented toward the co-curricular activities. And of course, as students move through the system and become seniors. And one of the things that's really struck us in looking at the co-curricular data is the range of clubs and other activities in which students participate in or even are officers or presidents of clubs. And I think it's at Berkeley, there are literally hundreds, if not 1,000, I can't remember, the enormous figure of student organizations. So that this is a whole nother sphere that has grown up over the last few decades. Some of it's obviously self-serving in terms of resume padding for my own club, and I'm the president of the club, and I get my friend to be the vice president. But as our colleague Steve Brint, UC Riverside, is doing a lot of research on now, it obviously provides the opportunity to develop leadership skills, presentation skills, real-world skills that, in fact, are as in high demand when one enters the workforce as are getting a high GPA and having other types of skills. The other thing that I want to emphasize that Igor presented a slide on is the gains in learning outcomes. What sets SERU apart from other research, whether it's NESE or the Harry Serp studies or whatever, typically those surveys ask students, how much have you gained or how much have you learned in a particular area? Maybe it could be critical thinking. A little, not since you've been at the university. None, a little, a lot, a great deal. Speaking skills, writing skills, whatever the skills may be. And the current take on that methodology in higher education is that those self-reports have very little validity for a number of reasons. They're just categorical judgments. They're not really anchored to anything. And so that the general take now is that student self-reports on learning outcomes is a dubious enterprise. From the beginning, SERU has been different. When we put together SERU at the very beginning, we made a self-conscious decision to go a little further in this realm and develop a set of indices where students first indicate, when you entered this university, where did you start? Now, where are you in terms of skills or proficiencies? And I've done a lot of research, a fair amount of research on establishing that this way of measuring learning outcomes has a much greater degree of validity. And it's very, very major and discipline specific. So that, in fact, the way to analyze this data is to look at where students say they're starting, and that varies by discipline. Not surprisingly, students going into quantitative-based majors are going to say they have higher quantitative skills. But then most importantly, to look at the gains between the starting point and where they are now as upper division or seniors. And again, this is very, very major specific, so that you would expect gains in quantitative skills in some fields. You expect no gains in quantitative skills, or relatively few, in other fields. Conversely, if you're an English major, you see gains in writing, in reading, and so forth and so on. And in our work, we've then correlated those outcomes. We've correlated those outcomes to other factors. For example, one good measure of relative success engagement in universities, what's your GPA? I mean, it's not a perfect measure, but what we show is that discipline by discipline, the students who report learning gains specific to that discipline, higher learning gains, have much higher GPAs in that major than those that report less learning gains. So I'm just giving you that as background to underpin this study, as what we're now looking at in this study is how the multiple forms of engagement translate into distinct patterns of learning outcomes. And we believe that these self-reported learning outcomes are a pretty solid indirect measure of how the consequences of successful engagement in the university. That's it. That's not it. John keeps me honest here, okay? Well, the point being here, the purpose of this presentation today was basically twofold. For John to really introduce you to the kind of the size and scope of the SERU project. And boy, it now has been, what, 2000 did we start this, John? I mean, we had our first meeting, and we collected our first data in 2002. As Ron indicated, we are confirmed we have over 700,000 student responses in our data set now. So this is the first point here. This is a massive project where we have data from all the UC campuses and a majority of the leading public research universities in the entire country, and in addition, an increasing complement of international universities across several continents. Second, the point of today's presentation, however, was just to basically introduce this framework, introduce the framework of multiple forms of engagement, and to suggest with some preliminary findings that I think we're on the right track in terms of being able to document the multiple pathways of successful engagement that undergraduates in public research universities can embark on. So we will continue to develop this data to look at things such as how do these different patterns of engagement relate to academic performance and graduation. As John alluded to, we'll be attempting to link this data to actual outcome data in terms of employment data. We'll seek to get some comparative data. And all is, as John emphasizes, we like to stress the research side of the SERU enterprise, but always in the forefront is the way in which the SERU data analysis can help further improve the undergraduate experience. So, John?
Thank you, Gregg. Mm-hmm. I should note, that we are influenced, and there was a presentation earlier at our SERU session by Tongshan Chang and others at the UC Office of the President have done very interesting work looking at UC data. The survey in the UC system is called UQs, and linking job and income and salary data of graduates, UC graduates, with the SERU UQs data set. So there's a lot of challenges to that, but we're hoping to collaborate with Tongshan and his colleagues to further that. So now we're doing pretty well. We would like to have both Josh Trapani and Christina Keller come up and talk and give a short comment on the data as they've seen, and they have each about 10 minutes to do that. So Josh, do you want to go first, or do you have to decide who would like to go first? It doesn't matter to me.
Okay, well,
This is Christine.
all right. I will go first. Christine Keller. I work at the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. So many of the public universities that participate in the SERU project are members of APLU. So I think that a couple of comments on the data that we just heard. I think that the results provide very compelling evidence that undergraduates at public universities are not adrift, but are active and engaged learners, researchers, and contributors to their broader communities. I think it's a strong foundation from which we can consider and discuss the broader questions of the symposium. There's such a wealth of valuable information within the presentation that I thought it might be useful to provide one example of the different uses of the data that John mentioned, that internal, the external, and the policy, how those interact and could be used to develop strategies for increasing a particular group of students. And then talk a little bit about the questions that remain and the research that is still needed. As many of you likely know, NSF recently released an RFP for the Includes program, which is an effort to create more effective pathways into STEM disciplines for both undergraduates and graduates, and to have some of those students go on into the professoriate. So this is a very important national conversation. So at APLU, we've been doing a lot of brainstorming on different approaches that one could use to help make those pathways more clear. So when I looked at the SERU data, I thought, I wonder, so what does the role of student engagement tell us? How could we use this information to provide clues to some potential actions that we could do for a proposal such as that RFP? And what are the questions that we still need to answer? So looking at the information, and you have to understand my background is institutional research, so I really love to look at data and ask questions and figure out what we could do to follow up. So the first set of information that really jumped out at me were the students who had significantly lower levels of curricular engagement. And those were freshmen and sophomores who were first-generation students, and they were majoring in STEM. Now, this is exactly the group we want to be more engaged in order to maximize their learning gains and increase their likelihood of completion. So given this information, what actions could universities consider and perhaps work together, perhaps the SERU institutions could work together to implement and test? Perhaps more direct outreach to these students to involve them early in high-impact practices such as learning communities or research or internships. Should that contact be made before a student sets foot on campus, rather than having these first-generation students try to figure it out on their own? Could a university dig a little deeper into their own data systems and examine the typical courses taken by these students? Do these courses provide opportunities for active learning, group projects, and presentation? Another area that seemed to deserve additional investigation was the group of students with low levels of research engagement. Now, these were male students, and they were at the freshman and sophomore levels. So we have evidence that students who participate in undergraduate research experiences are more likely to continue on and earn a PhD. Could an institution be more proactive and intentional in matching first and second year students with research experiences? To use the NSF language, how could we create a more clear pathway into STEM for students at the beginning of their undergraduate degree? Perhaps SERU data could be combined with other data sets like the National Student Clearinghouse and provide more information on transfer and completion patterns for STEM students across universities. The combined data set could show perhaps which students went on to enroll in graduate school. And of those students who enrolled in graduate students, go back and look at their patterns of engagement. What can we learn from that? Could we have other students go through those activities to move on to graduate students? Now, of course, the specific strategy or approach selected by a university is influenced by many factors, such as institutional context, goals, resources, and culture. But I think the power of the data like SERU is it can provide a place to start, to begin to unpack the underlying issues and ask the important questions that can lead to change and improvement. As we discussed earlier in the sessions today that really focused on the use of SERU data, it's supported by a robust theoretical framework, and I think this is really important. And that research demonstrates the strong positive influence of student engagement on learning and development and completion. And I was really intrigued by the last presentation then, which linked engagement to post-collegiate outcomes, the great work that the UC President's Office is doing to explore these issues. So I think this is where the policy piece comes in too, because one of the things we're advocating for very strongly at APLU is to lift the ban on collecting data at the student level, and so we can have a national data set that focuses on student outcomes, that we can track students across institutions, we can understand their outcomes after college. So think about what we could do. If we could link SERU data to a national data system, we could really dig into that earnings information. We could better understand whether civic engagement and internships really do have a positive influence on earnings. So I just think, again, the influence of policy on our data infrastructure is very, very important. So in conclusion, I think that the SERU findings do provide evidence of the public research university advantage and the many opportunities for students to be actively engaged in learning, discovery, and service. But I think it's also important to use the data to fulfill what I'll call the public research university responsibility to focus on innovation and improvement so that the educational opportunities available to students remain accessible, affordable, and of high quality.
Hi, I'm Josh Trapani from the Association of American Universities. Thank you very much for inviting me to learn more about SERU and to participate in this symposium. SERU is an incredible resource, and the results are definitely interesting and informative. A few years ago, in response to questions about why AAU's member institutions remained resistant to imposing standardized assessments of learning like the CLA, we conducted a survey and asked our members what tools they use to improve student learning and the student experience overall. Those who used the SERU survey spoke very highly of it as a way to foster institutional improvement. You heard SERU described by one of the PIs as a research tool with administrative uses, and we know it's succeeding in both regards. But AAU, as a national higher education association, spends most of its time in a different space, the federal policy space, and so that's where I want to focus my remarks. In particular, we see again and again that the tools that are most useful for research or for institutional self-improvement may not always translate to being good tools for external purposes like providing consumer information, advocacy, or accountability. So I want to make a few observations in the realm of translating SERU results to the public policy sphere, where there are some challenges but also great potential. Many policy-related conversations about undergraduate education focus on words like quality and value. For instance, the National Academies last December held a workshop entitled Quality in the Undergraduate Experience. What is it? How should it be measured? Who decides? Terms like quality and value have financial underpinnings, and many policy discussions center on the economics of undergraduate education. For instance, the administration's new college scorecard puts heavy emphasis on issues like cost, debt, and post-graduation earnings. These financial indicators are a valid and important part of the discussion, and so I think it's very wise for SERU to move forward in the direction of linking its data with employment and earnings outcomes, and we saw some very interesting and impressive early results from such linkage earlier today. I would include in that looking in more detail at graduate school attendance, as has been discussed, since that is one of the things that our institutions do. To make a point similar to one that Christine just made, when you're thinking about large administrative data sets at both the state and federal levels, as well as learning analytics and other big student-focused data sets that may come online, highlights what I see as one of the big advantages of SERU, which is taking a census approach. And so if you think of efforts like the University of Texas Systems, CQT, or the Institute for Research on Innovation and Science at the University of Michigan, they both rely on linking large administrative data sets. And so, unlike with SERU, it would, for example, be very difficult to link CLA results with individualized learning or outcomes data in a way that's meaningful. So this approach is very forward-looking. I also think that SERU's focus on student engagement is extremely useful. Likely by design, the SERU results look and sound like some of the results people are already familiar with from, for instance, Gallup's employee engagement surveys. And so this raises a few thoughts. The first is just the question. The answer is probably yes, but whether those working on SERU have looked into the Gallup-Purdue Index and whether they see any areas of synergy there. Second, I wonder if the focus on levels of engagement is a way to reduce the problem of a lack of comparative data, which you talked about before. So I agree that in the policy sphere, this lack of comparative data may be a problem, because when you say to a policymaker, so 92% of students at research universities have an above average level of engagement in at least one area, I suspect they will ask, well, is that better or worse than what happens at other kinds of schools? But I note that when Gallup reports that X% of employees are engaged at work, nobody asks compared to what. So it may be that some reframing is in order, and part of AAU's role as an advocate sometimes is to advocate against one-size-fits-all approaches and comparisons that don't fit our institutions. I don't think the focus on engagement eliminates the issue, and I'd still encourage SERU to look for comparative data, but I think it does mitigate it somewhat. So as I already alluded to, I think SERU's focus on research universities is both a blessing and a curse in the context of federal policy discussions. It's a blessing because it highlights the full breadth of the undergraduate experience. It's a curse because, as I mentioned, policymakers like to have broad, simple comparative data. On the flip side, I think augmenting the data to include more private research universities would be useful. This is probably not a surprising comment coming from me. AAU's members are both public and private. There's no doubt that there are important differences between public and private research universities, but when we advocate, we would like to be able to tell one story. I know private universities, some of them are using some other tools. I am not a person who is versed on all the history and all the difference between the tools. So what I would just say is that if research universities, public and private, were to adopt a common tool, it would be a boon for our advocacy because it would make it easier for us to tell that one story and demonstrate the value of undergraduate education at research universities in a unified way. One thing that struck me hard, and this has come up a couple of times while looking at the SERU data, especially at the gains reported in things like analytical and critical thinking skills, leadership and interpersonal skills, and the ability to understand and appreciate diversity and international perspectives, is that these are exactly the skills employers have said they're looking for again and again in surveys conducted, for example, by Hart Research Associates for the Association of American Colleges and Universities. The SERU data interestingly demonstrate that these gains don't come only or even in some cases primarily in the classroom. And I think showing these data to industry and nonprofit leaders could help create new partners for our advocacy. I noted too, as others have, that it's seniors who are most likely to be engaged and freshmen least likely, and this makes perfect intuitive sense, but it does have some potentially profound implications. For instance, I was thinking about what it might mean for the effectiveness of three-year degree programs. We know in some cases these have been instituted to save money, but the question is, what do they cost in terms of experience, some of which may equate to marketable skills, higher earnings, and even greater life satisfaction? And here I think we get to the real crux of it from the perspective of federal policy discussions. We all know that the undergraduate student experience at a research university isn't solely about what happens in the classroom. And yet, because many federal policy discussions lump different types of institutions with different missions into a single simplified model, we tend to equate undergraduate education almost solely with taking classes and earning a degree. And so the question becomes, so how do you justify the higher cost of taking classes at institution X versus institution Y? And that is not the correct question. Or it becomes a comparison of what are the projected costs and student debt versus the projected earnings if I go to institution X versus institution Y and major in whatever, which on the face of it seems very rational and objective, but it actually ignores not just the intangible benefits of education. not just the potential earning significance of specific experiences like internships, but also what we know about many incoming college students. They don't know what they want to do, even if they think they do, and they're at the university to figure it out by having a richness of experiences. So I think the SERU data can serve as an educational tool for policymakers, or at least a reminder that it's not as simple as often portrayed. And if we back up these data with stories and anecdotes about individual students doing amazing things across the 4 areas of engagement, I think it could be very powerful. It's valuable to think about the experience of undergraduates at research universities differentiated into these 4 types of engagement. At the same time, when we're talking to policymakers, we definitely can't, to use a cliche, lose the forest for the trees. We need to talk about how these areas connect and how the overall experience has emergent properties. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so the final thought I wanted to provide, and this is outside my sphere of expertise, but it struck me while looking at the data, is that these results in this way of describing types of engagement can also be an extremely useful frame for students and their families in thinking about what they want to get out of their college experience. And this point often gets lost as well in policy discussions, that students themselves have agency and choice, not just in deciding what institution to attend and what to major in, but also in choosing what other kinds of experiences to have during their undergraduate years. Students aren't just passive recipients of their undergraduate education. I think these data demonstrate that very strongly, that they have choices and that their choices are meaningful. And I think that's a lesson that will serve them well through the rest of their life.
Great, thank you. We want to really thank both of you for your very thoughtful comments. And now we're going to go to the floor, and maybe in the course of discussions, if Igor or Gregg or I have some comment to make about the presenters' interesting insights, then we'll do that as well. So the floor is open. We have Carol's given us a little extra time, so I'm watching the clock. Yes.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations. I was curious about other factors that vary across disciplines, like class size or faculty values and priorities with regards to research versus teaching. Does your survey take that into consideration or incorporate faculty data?
Do you want to answer that, Gregg, or do you want me to?
I can repeat my question.
Oh. Do you want to do? I guess do it again because we are recording this, but I'm sorry about that. Yes.
Thank you.
It's a good question.
Hello, I'm a graduate student. I'm Dax Vivid. I'm interested if you've looked at other factors with your survey, including how the size of the classroom or the priorities of faculty with regards to research versus teaching, which also varies across disciplines.
We have not, and it's a really good question. I've always worried and wanted us to try to pursue some kind of research related to small versus large classrooms, and does it matter? And for partly, not only for the edification of what we're doing as larger universities, but also so that we can have language in state legislatures about that there is value. We have done some work on it, and others have as well, but that we have not linked that kind of data yet into this kind of an analysis. Gregg, do you have anything you want to add to that?
John's right. I would just emphasize on the flip side, as I intimated, that in the analysis that we do of the data, especially for learning outcomes, but it could be for everything else, discipline matters. Obviously, they're core academic experiences and competencies that we expect all undergraduates to master. But as students declare majors, and partly because of different interests at the beginning, but more importantly, different socialization experiences as they go through the major, we see very distinct, different patterns of both engagement, learning outcomes, and of course aspirations for after the university. So one of the really key messages that we've noted in the SERU data for a long time now is that at major public research universities, the differences within the institution are greater, or I guess are pronounced, in what's absolutely interesting in the comparative data are the similarities in discipline across institutions. So that gives us a whole different way of looking at and conceptualizing the undergraduate experience, and gives us, on at least the local level, a very powerful policy or accountability tool in which, with the SERU data, a given department or major rather than compare itself to, am I above average or below average at my institution, say on student satisfaction or whatever, which, as you're pointing out, could vary with the differences across those disciplines as opposed to something intrinsic in terms of how well that discipline is doing itself. Rather than that, institutions can look at comparative data across SERU. So if I'm in the English department at Berkeley, what does my data look like for the student experience for 10 or 15 or other institutions, other English departments across the country? With one important caveat here, we're very, very protective of actually revealing individual identities of departments. We're not in the business of invidious comparisons. We're in the business of trying to find out, the general patterns. And just to reiterate, if you look at the structure of the UQ survey, the major emphasis is on the experience in the major. That's where we collect an amazing amount of data and information.
I would
Yeah,
just
Igor.
add, as a person responsible for the international side of the project, I would just add that surprisingly, it's more similar if you study math in China or Russia or in the United States. Those students have more similarities than students that study social sciences with them at the same university. So there are across those disciplines, the strength of disciplines go across, not only across institutions, but across countries as well.
And other questions? Oh, yes.
Good afternoon. I really enjoyed your presentation, Michael Jackson from University of Southern California.
Oh, yeah.
I noticed in your slides that you didn't talk about work and the amount of time that students devote to work, particularly when they're undergraduates and not wealthy, not upper middle class. And it seems to me that influences, for a lot of kids, their ability to be engaged in some of the things that you were talking about. So maybe, could you please talk about that?
Do you want to?
Yeah,
Igor.
I can take that. You're absolutely right. And since this is a work in progress, we're definitely will look into that at the next stage. And I agree that whether or not students has a job and in particular hours matters a lot.
Right. On the other hand, as Pamela presented in our morning session with data from the University of California, not to minimize individual cases where, let's say, low-income students have to work more hours than they should. The general pattern across the entire data set is that students at the major public research universities actually work fewer hours than, on average, than one would anticipate, especially in the freshman year. And moreover, the correlation or relationship between the number of hours worked is not necessarily even, say, negative in terms of GPA, unless you get into an inordinate amount of hours worked. Then, in fact, students who work no hours have lower GPAs than students who work a few hours. Now, the reason for that, of course, is the causality in terms of work and impact works in both directions. In other words, one generally tends to think that if you work a certain amount of hours, it has an impact on your academic performance. But the converse is true too. To some extent, how you're doing academically or whether you have your life together or not, in part dictates how many hours you work for some people in a given semester. So that's one of the reasons you don't generally see much of a correlation at all between academic performance and hours worked. Nonetheless, your point is still well taken that there are certain populations of students who, absolutely, we have to look at in terms of the impact of work. You mentioned you're from USC?
Yeah.
We forgot to mention, and we're talking about the public research universities, we in fact have a token private university.
That's not the right terminology.
Go Trojans.
I'll make a little comment about privates and
That was
publics
on purpose.
at the very end. I would just add to this storyline a little bit is that in the data set between AAUs and UCs, students at UC work less hours on average. I know this is an average, so there's all kinds of things you have to drill down to really understand it. And yet it also, the UCs tend to have more low-income students as well, which might say, I'm only kind of extrapolating here, is that we have a very extensive financial aid program here, in which about 33% of every tuition dollar goes back into tuition, which has been, I think, we have a high number of low-income students, and there's some relationship to that. They're also working less, so that's an interesting aspect. What is the role of financial aid? And we haven't had that in our analysis thus far. I will say that one has to worry when you look at a place like Berkeley, because we have so much money going to financial aid, yet we have a lot of low-income students. I'm just posing the question is, can we afford to have so many low-income students in light of our financial difficulties? I'm not saying that. I'm just posing how complex the world is in the financial aspect. So, sorry, go ahead.
Just give you one final comment here too. USC also has a high proportion of low-income students. It's been very much a part of their admissions and recruitment strategy.
14% first generation
Yeah.
the highest of all the private research.
Yes, right. So,
Yeah, no,
so
USC is a one-off in many ways, and in a good way, yeah.
we know that.
Yeah. Other questions? Oh, over here, yes. Please,
hi.
could you please identify yourself?
Yes,
Yeah,
I'm-
just to help, yeah.
Alex Schwartz, UC Berkeley. This is probably a pretty basic question that I know the answer to if I'd been here earlier today, but I was just wondering how you define engagement, academic engagement, because on the slide where you said it was, that students who are academically engaged were more likely to go to class and do their homework, I thought those would be indicators of engagement, so it felt a little chicken and eggy to me, and it's probably just because I don't understand it, but I'm just wondering if you could explain how you define them as engaged in the first place before you go on to see what else they're doing.
We X out that
Thank you.
slide.
Yeah, we didn't want to bother you with the facts.
Igor, why don't you respond to that?
I don't know if it's possible to show the slide that has.
You might be able to hold up.
Which one is the curricular engagement?
Exercise.
Yeah, can you move to
Is that it? This is curricular engagement. Is that what you want to see?
Yeah. This is so we have to all of the engagement indices. There are questions that were asked in the survey, and if I remember correctly, yes, this is the items that went to the index, and some items, for example, like time use, were not in the indices, though that we can validate the indexes using these extra variables. That's why they were not included.
Yeah. And I'm sorry. I was alluding to the fact that the way this particular definition of curricular engagement, and there could be others, does put an emphasis on in classroom engagement, asking insightful questions, things of that nature, which, as I noted, is actually most likely correlated, getting back to the issue of discipline. There may be some disciplines where that's more likely than in other disciplines, and therefore is also correlated with choice of major, and which is correlated with parental educational background and so forth and so on. So one of the findings that students whose parents have higher levels of education appear to be more curricularly engaged, but we have to sort of unpack that in terms of what that actually means. A different analysis would be focusing, as Igor just alluded to, defining academic engagement not in terms of engagement with other people, whether it's collaborative learning or speaking up in classroom or interacting with your faculty member, but actual engagement with, on a personal individual level, your academic stuff. So that would be more like time spent studying. Do you go to class, do all the reading, or all is prepared, and things like that. That would be a different analysis, and we might come up with different correlates if we did it that way.
I will note that Gregg skipped over the slide that shows how we were actually using factor scores to come up with this list. So, and what other ways we could have looked at it, but we did this evaluation, and we have a consulting group we talk with. It's not just us, and you saw other people that are part of the project, including Ron Husman and Steve Brenner, Riverside and Tongshan Chang, but then other people as well. Is there another question? Also something for Josh or Christine as well, but, oh yeah, go ahead, Darwin. And then, could you hold on just a second, because you're going to get a microphone.
Darwin Hendel, University of Minnesota. I very much like the notion of the research university and what advantage that has. I wonder, though, how good of a job each of our institutions does in conveying to students up front what that really means. I think students come into a university, many of whom don't really have a clear sense of what kind of institution they're in, and especially students who come into land-grant universities. I think the vast majority of students graduate from a land-grant university without any sense of what that really means. So I think part of all of this is conveying more completely up front what it means to be at one of our research universities and to make suggestions to them as to what they should be encouraged to do to take advantage of that advantage.
Okay. So you had a question. Oh, was there one up here? Sorry. I can't see. Yes, right here, right?
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Matt Bozer. I'm on the staff here at Berkeley. I'm curious to ask for your rationale. It seems like the data have presented, and this is like a high-level takeaway. The data have been presented in a better than the median level of engagement, but I feel like one could choose to look at this comes to a sort of a philosophical question. If you looked at the same data and you said the target was highly engaged in contrast to just better than the median, then that paints a very different picture. And I'm unaware. I had to just sort of what is the rationale for better than the median, and where is where do you feel like our system, all the colleges that are represented, the presumption is better than the median truly the target, or should it be a high level of engagement? Because correct me if I have this wrong, I think 66% have at least high level engagement in one of the 4 domains, which means 33% are not highly engaged in any of the 4 domains, and that's less rosy. So that's my question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a really good perspective. As we talked about today, we were looking at truly, purely only relative measures. And I'd only say we moved to the upper quartile as opposed to above the median as intuitively made more sense, right? The other approach is to actually use some kind of absolute definition, as you're saying, of high engagement. And actually, we did some preliminary research a couple of years ago where we used that, came up with basically the same kinds of results. But for myself personally, I think that if we do need to move to, in addition to the relative engagement, look at what do we actually, and have discussion about, what do we actually mean by highly engaged? What kind of consensus would we get? Yes, not the person scores such and such on a scale, but in absolute terms, in terms of activities, let's say co-curricular activity. I mean, what would demonstrate what everyone or reasonable people would agree means high co-curricular engagement? You're an officer in a club. You do X number of hours per week. And we use that sometimes as a filter. It's not because what you say you do. How many hours do you report doing it? What particular levels, what particular activities have you actually done in the last academic year or whatever? And build a profile in that way. So yeah, I think your point is right on.
Yeah. I think one last question, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you very much. Josie Baltodano, I direct the Executive Leadership Academy at the Center. And I was waiting for those extra slides when you cross-reference students of color.
Yeah.
Do you have them?
Oh.
Well, we had some in the earlier slides that were in the low, high end, but it's not a detailed, it's very generalized. So this is all, whether it's talking about the lower quartile and the upper quartile, we need to investigate more and discuss and see what that means versus the median, definitely. And that we need to, this is part of the research agenda, to unpack this, as I noted previously, or we noted previously, to look at subpopulations, both discipline and race and ethnicity and social class. So we have a lot of work we feel that we have to do, but we have put a lot of effort into this initial framework. And so we're very open to additional criticism or thoughts or input, and maybe we could figure out a way to have you give us that input in some systematic way. And you can contact any of us as well, and we'll provide that kind of information later after the conference is over. With that, I need to wrap up. I know Carol's getting anxious, so that we move on. I just want to say, the one thing I want to say is, Josh, what you said was music to our ears. We would love to have some of the private AUs. Only USC is joined because they're progressive. And we have tried and tried, and the privates just have a different mentality. They're not interested in data sharing in the same way. And I will say they do have an instrument through Kofi, but my understanding is it's nothing like what we have. So we have like the cat's meow of research institution surveys, which is always evolving, and it would be great to get some more privates in, but it is problematic.
Please thank John and his panel.